We're pleased to have Rory Johnston joining us today. He's the founder of Commodity Context, a physical commodity research firm. Rory, thank you so much for joining us. And I just want to jump right in. Why do you think OPEC decided to announce this surprise cut instead of waiting until their June meeting? I know there's a lot of competing theories on this.
Yeah, I think the reason they didn't wait until their June meeting is that, conditions had obviously deteriorated. And I think, whatever way you can cut it, there was concern about, stemming from this latest banking crisis, driven oil sell-off. There was concern about that in OPEC member capitals. And I think this is clear indication of that. But I think in terms of, the impetus as to why this happened now, I see kind of three main reasons. One, as you noted, I think there are some building demand concerns that even if demand isn't going to be, terrible this year, I think there's increasing concerns that the combination of a slower than expected start in China, the combination of the banking crisis and everything else are, maybe we're just not going to get that same gangbusters level growth that a lot of analysts, OPEC included, were counting on, particularly in the second half of the year. On top of that, I think that, you've already heard from the Saudi energy minister that, there was a lot of concern about this, macro and unoil related shorting activity of oil markets. And what you saw coming out of that banking crisis was in many cases some, historic levels of shorting, particularly in WTI contracts. So I think there was a degree of kind of punishing the shorts, in this cut. And I think that definitely helps explain the timing as well, because theoretically, this is, the time is ripest when those shorts are deepest in order to kind of punish them. And finally, I think, what you did see kind of comments around were, references to the recent failure of the United States and of the White House to make good on its commitment to refill the SPR once prices fell below that $67 to $72 barrel range. I think there's open debate as to how much they believe that would ever actually happen, but at the very least, they're using the opportunity to kind of twist the knife in kind of the side of DOE and the SPR here about that kind of failure to kind of stick up for that commitment.
Yeah, and I just want to talk about the White House because obviously they're the loser in this situation. You had them coming out saying this cut was ill-advised. What are your thoughts on the U.S. becoming not the number one customer anymore, or maybe not the most important ally to OPEC? What implications will that have?
I think there's absolutely no doubt at this stage that there has been, a grievous and acute deterioration in relations between particularly Washington and Riyadh, and that there's just no way around this. Combine that with the fact that this administration has been outright hostile on many occasions to the fossil fuel industry, even during times of acute crisis that we saw last year, and the fact that they committed to this SPR refill and then kind of waffled on it, straight through. So I think there's no doubt that this plays in. It's difficult, if you look at his historical OPEC behavior, I do think the probability here is that those demand concerns did actually play, number one on the list of reasons to cut. But historically, you may have seen some pressure from Washington that may have been able to push them off that kind of immediacy, but that's just not happening anymore. Those lines of communication have firmly deteriorated, and I think, all else equal, we're just going to see more and more of an independent OPEC behavior going forward. One final thing to say on this, and I do think even if I think even more of an important element here than, the lack of the U.S. being kind of number one consumer or even ally of OPEC is the fact that U.S. shale production just isn't as price responsive today as it was historically. So historically, over the past kind of, 10 years almost, anytime OPEC would have had a material cut that would have seen a big boost to prices, the immediate concern across every kind of OPEC member capital was they were going to lose that production and that market share to kind of surging U.S. shale production. The fact that U.S. shale was already slowing with prices above $100 a barrel, I think gives OPEC membership, a much greater leeway in conducting these supply operations because they're actually just going to have a straight line effect on price without kind of throwing a bone to ceding market share to shale.
Interesting. And I just want to shift and get your insight on demand. Typically when OPEC cuts, it signifies that demand is going to be weak. What's your outlook on demand for the second half of the year?
Yeah, and so what we've seen so far, year to date has been demand has been fine. I think it's, no one I think thus far is seeing kind of cratering demand, but I also don't think demand has been as strong as many people were hoping it was going to be at this stage in the recovery. That, remember that we're still in this kind of post-COVID recovery phase where we're supposed to have all of this pent-up demand that's coming down the line. It's supposed to kind of, there should be kind of no doubts in people's mind or in the market's mind that demand is strong. And I think clearly there are some doubts. So I think that is where this does come off. While this is no doubt a bullish kind of development for the oil market, all else equal, because fewer barrels of crude coming through the supply side means tighter balances. Enough said. But this also certainly isn't an indication of a position of strength on the part of OPEC. That you got this big, massive, the first real, honest to God surprise supply cut from OPEC in ages, and it really just brought us back to kind of $84 to $86 a barrel Brent, which is kind of the midpoint of where we've been trending all year. So, all else equal, we're at a stage now where that massive cut only brought us back to that midpoint. So I think that is your kind of indication of, things are not all well in the oil market. But, if we see these cuts actually realized in the market to anywhere near that kind of million barrel a day degree that they've committed to now, that's inevitably going to tighten things. And I think we're finally going to then be able to see those inventory draws that are going to kind of, re-alert the market to those tightening kind of fundamental conditions, which just year to date haven't really been that, indisputable.
And so when you add in Russia's ongoing cuts, we're looking at about 1.6 million barrels per day off the market by July, which should make things even tighter. What implications will that have, or how do you see that playing out? Are you watching Russia at all, or do you think it's significant?
Yeah, I've been pretty skeptical, very frankly, of Russia's 500,000 barrel a day kind of voluntary supply cut commitment. And I've said as much many, many times in the past. Essentially, the challenge there is they've been very wishy-washy. They've, the timeline has moved all around. They're like, oh, we're going to give 500, and they got 200. It's because of, retaliation against Western sanctions, but actually it's only temporary because we're going to get our stuff back together. It's been all over the place. And I actually think, to a degree, including the Russia cuts with these, which I find kind of much more legitimate and kind of confidence-inspiring cuts from OPEC, actually kind of diminishes the OPEC cuts to a degree. And I think that could actually be part of the reason why we didn't get as much of a price response as many were expecting, because I think, there's still open questions as to how much crude we're actually going to get cut from OPEC. The last November's cut, or October, November, you really didn't see as much oil come off as, they committed. They committed for 2 million, and you got less than 1 million. Are we going to see something similar this year? Actually, most of the countries that voluntarily committed actually do have the scope to cut, countries like Saudi, countries like UAE, et cetera. So I do think that chunk, that 1.1 or so million barrels a day commitment from OPEC is actually, has a degree of confidence behind it. Whereas Russia's, who knows? I honestly don't think that Moscow even knows what's going to be happening with its oil industry between now and July. And I have no doubt that if any country is going to cheat, it will be Russia, because it's already producing so far below its quota. It's kind of hard to kind of measure in the same way. But all in all, it is a big cut. And I think that, if even part of that hits the market, it's going to materially tighten balances.
Well, thank you so much, Rory, for joining us to discuss the surprise OPEC cut. And I know you're the founder of Commodity Context. For those that aren't familiar with your research newsletter, where can they find you?
That's exactly right. So, anyone interested can find all of my work at commoditycontext.com. I write on Substack, and, I've got a couple different research products there, both thematic research, a weekly wrap-up of kind of oil markets published every Friday at 4 to 4:30 p.m., and also kind of a couple, 2 different monthly reports. They're data-heavy and kind of wrap everything up and kind of on a constant tracking basis.